Samson was a character that I think hits too close to home for many of us. He's just about like what we are and what we want and what we're going to do and what it will pay to get it. Samson starts out in Judges 13, and I want to read some verses here as we begin. Once again, wow, you guys better have your binoculars on. I thought you could read them, but I don't know if you can or not. Once again, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord handed them over to the Philistines for 40 years. A certain man from Zorah was named Manoah. He was from the tribe of Dan. Now Manoah had a wife who wasn't able to have children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and he said, "You are not able to have children, but you're going to become pregnant, and you will have a baby boy." He said, "Make sure you do not drink any kind of wine. Also make sure you do not eat anything that is unclean. You will become pregnant. You will have a son. He must not use a razor on his head. He must not cut his hair. That's because the boy will be a Nazirite. He will be set apart to God from the day he's born. He will begin to save Israel from the power of the Philistines." You know, our world is so weird. We just heard Mike talk about how sometimes we don't get what we think we ought to get. Well, there's a lot of people that are born to privileges. And what they do with them, who knows? Some of them use them to take advantage and make their life succeed. And then there's others who are opposite, who are born to nothing, and they rise above it as they work hard. Samson was an example of the underachiever. He was an example of the former with many advantages, and he didn't make it. He didn't succeed. He was born at a special time in Israel's history. 7 times this nation had rebelled into apostasy, and this time it was the Philistines, which God used to punish and oppress for 40 years. God likes some 40-year numbers, doesn't he? You got a lot of 40-year numbers in the Bible. They were their worst enemy, and I'm talking about God's people. You know what Samson means? In a literal sense, it means sunshine. Samson was born in the darkest days of the nation's history. In other words, sunshine came into the world. And he was supposed to make a big difference. He was a Nazirite, which means he was different. He was separated. He was set aside. He was not to have any wine or fruit of the vine. He couldn't come near or touch a dead body, whether animal or human, and he couldn't cut his hair. Why couldn't he cut his hair? You know, I went to 1 Corinthians 14 and I thought this right away. Suppose a man has long hair. Doesn't the very nature of things teach you that it's shameful? That's a Nazirite. They're shamed in front of other people. It was an act of humility. It was an act of self-abasement to take this shame upon himself. So let's continue with this story. Samson went down to Timnah. His father and mother went with him, and they approached the vineyards of Timnah. Suddenly a young lion came roaring toward Samson. And then the Spirit of the Lord came on Samson with power. He tore the lion apart with his bare hands. He did it easily, as he might have torn a young goat apart. But he didn't tell his father or mother what he had done. There was a time when he was confronted by that wild lion. Now, could he have succeeded on his own? Absolutely not. He had no weapons, but God gave him the strength to be able to take care of that lion. On another occasion, he slew 1,000 Philistines with just the jaw of a donkey. 1,000 Philistines, army people. And he had a little short donkey jaw. How'd he do it? I don't know, but he did it. On another occasion, he lifted the gates of the city up on the hill, or lifted the gates of the city up on his shoulders, and he walked off, and he took it up on top of a hill and laid it down. What'd this guy look like? No, I mean, we see all sorts of different depictions. Did he look like Schwarzenegger? You think? I don't think so. I think he was very average. How do I know that? Because Delilah asked him the secret of his strength. If he'd had huge, bulging muscles, would she have asked? It wasn't obvious, but he had supernatural strength. Like this example, later on, Samson went to visit his wife, and he took a young goat with him, and he went at the time the wheat was being gathered, and he said, I'm going to my wife's room, but her father wouldn't let him go in. Her father said, I was sure you really hated her, so I gave her to your friend. Isn't her younger sister more beautiful? Take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I'm going to hurt them badly. So he went out and he caught 300 fox. He tied them in pairs by their tails. Then he tied a torch to each pair of tails, and he lit the torches. He let the foxes loose in the fields of grain that belonged to the Philistines, and he burned up the grain that had been cut and stacked. He burned up the grain that was still growing, and he also burned up the vineyards and olive trees. And the Philistines said, who did this? They were told Samson did it. Wow, when the Spirit of the Lord had come upon him, he could do some tremendous things. How would you go about catching 300 pairs of foxes? How far would you have to travel to find 300 pairs of foxes? And I can't imagine that they're like rats, even where he lived. He would have had to taken some tremendous amount of time, and not only strong in the body, but he must have been able to run like crazy because he could catch them. He was sharp-witted, too. God had given him a great wit, and he loved riddles. And he had a great sense of humor. No wonder his name was Sunshine. He was a bundle of potential. And yet, it's not a happy story we're sharing today. It's a tragedy. He went from hero to zero, from victor to victim. Disobedience, defeat, disgrace, and destruction were the words used to describe Samson. Oh, he was bold before men, but weak before women. He had the Spirit of God upon him, but he lived for the appetites of the flesh. He was called upon to declare war upon the enemies of God, but many times we find him fraternizing with that enemy, or at least the enemy women. He fought the Lord's battles by day, and he broke the Lord's commandments by night. Sunshine was his name, which speaks of light, yet he ended his life in darkness because the Philistines poked his eyes out. At times, he soared to incredible heights, and at times he sunk to indescribable depths. If you had told Samson at the beginning of his life what he would do in the end, do you think he would have believed him? I don't think he would have believed it. Do you realize there's 3 people sitting in your seat? Look around, there's 3 people sitting in your seat. The person you are right now, the one you could be for God, and the one you could be for the devil. 3 different people. Was Samson saved? Well, I'm assuming he was, because Hebrew 11 mentions him as a hero of the faith. If Samson was saved, he still wasn't able to choose the consequences of sin. He still had to pay the price. And Samson paid a high price for his low life. I think what begins with this Samson dishonored his parents. Judges 14:1, Samson went down to Timnah. And there he saw a young Philistine woman. And when he returned, he spoke to his father and mother, and he said, I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Get her for me. I want her to be my wife. His father and mother replied, can't we find you a wife for you among your relatives? Isn't there one among any of our people? Do you have to go to the Philistines to get a wife? They aren't God's people. They haven't even been circumcised. But Samson said to his father, get her for me. She's the right one for me. Here's the first step in his downward journey. He had godly parents who pleaded with him to do what's right and avoid that unequal yoke of 2 Corinthians 6. Let's look at that. It says, do not be joined to unbelievers. What do right and wrong have in common? Can light and darkness be friends? And that went clear back to Samson's day. You know, a threefold cord is pretty hard to break. You can break individual strings. When you start putting them together, they get pretty tough. The threefold cord of husband, wife, and God is a strand not easily broken. But when God doesn't hold them together, it's very easy for them to come untwined. Exodus 20:12 says, honor your father and mother, then you will live a long time in the something. How about land? I don't know where it went to. The Lord your God is giving you. These are promises for us too. But you know what? Samson's just went towards his parents. He didn't care anything about them. So let's go to number 2. What's the next thing that he did? Samson deserted his promise. Judges 14:5 starts out this way. Samson went down to Timnah. The down is the key thing here. He's descending down, a geographical term, but it's got more meaning than that. When you run from God, you're going down. Ask poor old Noah how far he had to go down until God got his way. He went to a vineyard. He went to a place where he was not supposed to be. He was not to eat any grapes. He was not to drink any wine or anything made from fruit of the vine. You say, that's just a little thing, isn't it? I mean, how trivial can you get? Yeah, well, it's those little foxes running around that spoils everything, isn't it? They start to get into your life, and it's when we are just flirting with sin that we start to kind of lose our balance. And we might slide right down that slope that we shouldn't be on. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Samson with power. He tore the lion apart with his bare hands. He did it as easily as he might have torn a young goat apart, but he didn't tell his father or mother what he'd done. And then he went down and talked with the woman, and he liked her. Sometime later, he was going back to get married to her, but he turned off the road to look at the lion's dead body. Large numbers of bees and some honey were in it. He dug the honey out with his hands. He ate it as he walked along. Then he joined his parents again, and he gave them some honey, and they ate it too. But he didn't tell them that he had taken it from the lion's dead body. It was unclean food. For the Nazirite, it was unclean to even go near that body. Unclean to touch it. More disobedience. He just keeps violating his vows that he made. He's losing his focus. He's sinning in high gear now. Now he's just cruising along. And you know what? He's going down, down, down. Samson reminds me a lot of Lot. You know, in the end of the Lot story, what's he doing? He's committing incest with his daughters, giving birth to wicked nations which still plague the earth today. And yet in the beginning, Lot was a godly man. No one would have thought he was capable of such things. How did it start for Lot? What did he do? He looked at Sodom. And when him and Abraham were deciding who was going to get what, he said, I want to go towards the city. He looked that way. He walked that way. He pitched his tents that way. And eventually he was so enthralled with the city that he moved inside the city and he sat at the city gates. Now that was reserved for uppity-uppities, elders with lots of intelligence. They were there to take care of the people. But the deeper that he got into sin, the blinder he got. And that's the same exact thing with Samson. He was blind long before they took his eyes out. Samson distorted his purpose. God had set him aside to do a certain job. And Samson's father that went down to see the woman, and Samson had a big dinner prepared there. He was following the practice of men when they got married. I thought the bride did that. We've just gotten away from the real biblical way of getting married. The bride pays for everything. No, the husband pays for everything. He made the big dinner. When the people saw Samson, they gave him 30 companions. He was going to have some fun with them. Let me tell you a riddle, Samson said to the companions. The dinner will last for 7 days. Give me the answer to the riddle before the dinner ends, and if you do, I'll give you 30 linen shirts. I'll also give you 30 sets of clothes. But suppose you can't give me the answer, then you must give me 30 linen shirts. You must also give me 30 sets of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they said. Let's hear it. Samson replied, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. 3 days they puzzled. They couldn't figure it out. Here he is at that wedding, or supposed wedding. All the guests are Philistines. Is he with the right crowd? Is he keeping the right company? Proverbs 13:20 says, anyone who walks with wise people, wise men, shall be wise. But a companion of fools shall be destroyed. The riddle that he gave, of course, hinged upon his experience with what? The lion. There's no way they could figure it out without knowing that happened. So they go to his wife to get her to entice him to give up the answer. Let's look at a couple more verses. On the 4th day, they spoke to Samson's wife. Get your husband to explain the riddle to us, they said. If you don't, we'll burn you to death. We'll burn up everyone in your family. Did you invite us here to rob us? Then Samson's wife threw herself on him and she sobbed, you hate me, you don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. I haven't even explained it to my father or mother, he replied. So why should I explain it to you? But she was threatened with a horrible death. And her family also. So she began to turn on the tears. Of course, poor old Samson wasn't really immune to that. So it says in verse 17, she cried during the whole 7 days the dinner was going on. Ugh. Wow. Can you really cry that long? Or is this kind of a fakey thing she's got going here? On the 7th day, he finally told her the answer to the riddle. That's because she kept on asking him to tell her. And then she explained the riddle to her people. Samson could stand before an army, but not before a crying woman. I kind of get a kick out of this particular verse. I've heard this since I was just little. In the King James, it reads a little bit different. In the King James, it says, "You're plowing with my heifer." Guys, don't call your wife a heifer. It's not a good idea. Or a young cow, like the New International says. Yeah. He called his wife a heifer. You think she heard? I bet she did. But Samson's just playing games. Playing games with the enemy. He's not fighting God's battles. He's fighting his own. He's distorted his purpose. And I look at our country and I see that America is no longer fighting the real enemy. But we're fighting battles internally, playing games with ourselves. God gives us good gifts and abilities. We must not prostitute ourselves and use them for the wrong purposes, but only for God. Samson defiled his purity. The plot thickens. He's looking for trashy women. Are they hard to find? No. Let's go to Judges 16. One day Samson went to Gaza. There he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. And the people of Gaza were told, "Samson is here." So they surrounded the place. They hid and waited for him at the city gate all night long. They didn't make any move against him during the night. They said, "Let's wait till the sun comes up and then we'll kill him." Bad mistake. Samson gets up in the middle of the night, rips the doors of the city off, carries them up on a hill, gives them a throw. The city's standing wide open. He didn't get murdered that morning. Verse 4 says, sometime later. Verse 4 says, sometime later. Oh, it's on the bottom of that. I'm sorry. Samson fell in love again. I wonder how many of these loves were really loves. The woman lived in the valley of Sorek, and her name was Delilah. Now, we've heard of Delilah. Proverbs 5:3 says, a woman who commits adultery has lips that drip honey. What she says is smoother than oil, but in the end, she's like bitter poison. She cuts like a sword that has two edges. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. You know, this story continues. The devil will never show us the end of the story because sin has a blinding, desensitizing effect. Proverbs 6:32 says a woman who commits adultery has no sense. Anyone who does it destroys himself. He will be beaten up and dishonored, and his shame will never be wiped away. You know, how unique are sexual sins? And that's really everything that Samson got caught in. That's all he knew. And his consequences go on, and forgiveness is still possible, but the consequences continue. Samson diluted his power. Now he's sitting in Delilah's hair salon. She tries to learn the secret of his strength, and he toys with her. He tells her lies. Tie me with new leather straps. Breaks them. Tie me with new ropes. He breaks them. Weave my hair. Doesn't do any good. But he's getting closer to the truth, isn't he? Because he's went from binding to the hair. The devil just tries to get us to take just little steps. Finally, poor old Samson caves in, tells her the truth. Breaks the final part of his Nazirite vow. Now it's too late. Point of no return. And here's the saddest verse out of this whole thing. Verse 17. So he told her everything. I've never used a razor on my head, he said. I've never cut my hair. That's because I've been a Nazirite since the day I was born. A Nazirite is set apart to God. If you shave my head, I won't be strong anymore. I'll become as weak as any other man. She called out, Samson, the Philistines are attacking you. And he woke up from his sleep and he thought, I'll go out just as I did before. I'll shake myself free. But he didn't know that the Lord had left. Isn't that like us? We get so wrapped up in stuff that we don't even know when the Lord's not standing beside us anymore because we're wrapped up in too much stuff. 21st verse says, and the Philistines grabbed hold of him. They poked his eyes out. They took him down to Gaza. They put bronze chains around him. And then they made him grind grain in prison. He lost his power and he didn't even know it. How many of us don't know how cold we've grown in our walks with the Lord? How far away from God that we've slowly become. The great lesson of this book is that God would rather forgive, though, than judge. And along the way, Samson made a lot of mistakes, but he made them right, and he'd been restored. But he went all the way with his sin. Sin binds, sin blinds, and then sin grinds, slowly grinding you away little by little. Even in the downfall of America, we seem to be witnessing this sort of a thing already happening. But you know what? God would rather forgive than judge. So there is some hope. There still could be a great victory in a tragedy. Multitudes could be saved if we would go through a mighty judgment. I think sometimes we've got it too good. We don't need God. What do we need him for? We're getting along day by day. But God can still get a great victory, even with us, if we'll just follow him closer. Verse 23 says, the rulers of the Philistines gathered together. They were going to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon. They were going to celebrate. They said, our God has handed our enemy Samson over to us. And when the people saw Samson, they praised their God. They said, our God has handed our enemy over to us. Our enemy has destroyed our land. He's killed large numbers of people. And after that, they had drunk a lot of wine. They shouted, bring Samson out. We need another verse, I think. We don't have another area. They let him put on a show for us. So they called Samson out of prison, and he put on a show for them. They had him stand near the temple pillars, and then he spoke to the servant who was holding his hand. He said, put me where I can feel the pillars. I'm talking about the ones that hold the temple up. I want to lean against them. The temple was crowded with men and women. All of the Philistine rulers were there. About 3,000 men and women were on a roof. They were watching Samson put on a show. And Samson prayed to the Lord. He said, Lord and King, show me that you still have concern for me. God, please make me strong just one more time. Let me pay the Philistines back for what they did to my two eyes. Let me do it with only one blow. And then Samson reached toward the two pillars that were in the middle of the temple. They held the temple up. He put his right hand on one of them. He put his left hand on the other. He leaned hard against them. Samson said, let me die together with the Philistines. Then he pushed with all his might, and the temple came down on the rulers. It fell on all of the people who were in it. So Samson killed more Philistines when he died than he did when he lived. God wants to use you. He wants to take you on to do some great things if you'll let him. But first of all, we got to do some little things. First, we got to prove to him that were capable of listening to him. You know, Samson, if he would have just listened to God and went with these vows that he had, the Nazarite, none of this would have happened. But of course, God must have had a plan. You know, you too are destined for greatness. What will you do for God? The story of Samson should touch each one of us very, very deeply. We should realize that we're pulling the same thing that Samson was pulling, maybe not on quite as grand a scale, but we do the same thing. We leave God out. We chase after things that we shouldn't. We put priorities in things that we shouldn't. We have the wrong type of companions. You know, this whole life, the Satan has got geared to trip you and knock you down and take you away from the Lord. That's his whole purpose. And he and his demons have 24 hours a day to do that. How easy it is to sometimes listen to what they have to say. How easy is it sometimes to just forget that Jesus did anything for us because we're so wrapped up in making money and doing this, that, and the other thing. Is, hey, Jesus might just as well be invisible because we don't see him at all. We don't feel him at all. But yet you look around you, you can see Jesus. You look at everything that he made, everything that's growing, everything that you eat, the house over your head, he gave that to you. But we would rather, I think, just let him be. We don't want to listen to what he has to say. If we listen to what he has to say, we're going to have to do something. And I don't think I have time to do that.